If you're looking to buy a stacked NBA 2K account with max badges and more, visit sportstmb.com. He has been in the community for years and has hundreds of reviews. Click the first link in the description to get your account today.
Before this video starts, if you enjoy this video, there are many more like it already on the channel, with many more like it to come in the future, so subscribe. I'm trying to hit 100,000 subscribers by the end of the year, so I would really appreciate it. I upload almost daily on this channel, so if you're looking for some consistent sports talk, this is the place for it. Also, drop a like on the video, it only takes a second, and it makes a massive difference. Also, if you have not checked it out yet, there is a new episode of the Hawks My GM out now that covers the first round of the playoffs versus the Boston Celtics. So if you haven't given that a look yet, go do so. But today's video is on a topic that I have been dropping bits and pieces of in some recent videos, especially in my video on the 2017 Warriors. And that topic is some of the myths of the 90s. The 1990s is probably the most glorified era in NBA history, especially because the player most considered to be the GOAT played in that era. However, like really every era in NBA history, there are many things that people say about it that are just straight up not true. And these can be both positive falsehoods that help the image of the 90s and negative falsehoods that hurt the image of the 90s. So let's take a look at a few myths of the NBA in the 90s. Now in this video you are going to hear me compare the 90s to the modern era quite a bit, and the reason for that is because a lot of the myths that you hear about the 90s come when people are comparing now and then. A lot of these myths come from when people try and compare the two and make the 90s look like they're better than they are or worse than they are, depending on what side of the debate you're on. To try and appease the older NBA fans that watch my videos, I actually checked my analytics and most of my audience is 30-ish years old, which I was pretty surprised by. I'm going to address some of the dumb criticisms of the 90s that make it look worse than it actually was. The idea that Michael Jordan played against plumbers is both a criticism of Jordan and a criticism of the era in itself. Now, one of my favorite videos that I've ever made covered this topic, but I will dive into it here. Basically, the notion is that the NBA wasn't as talented back in the 90s, or at least not by comparison to the modern era, and it also wasn't nearly as athletic. Now, the notion that the game is more athletic now than it was in the 90s is true, however, that's just a natural part of the progression of time, as well as technology that comes with that. Because of modern understandings of the human body, different training techniques, diets that come down to the exact amount of carrots you eat, it's easier than ever for a person with unlimited resources to get ripped as possible, conditioned as much as possible, as durable as possible, and all around allow a player to hit their peak athletically. That's why when you see players in the 90s being a good bit skinnier than you would expect them to be today, that's just really a limitation of the time. It's a disadvantage that those players had to deal with in their time, just like players of the 2010s and 2020s are not going to have the advantages of players in the 2050s. By 2050, I'm sure there are going to be shakes that you can drink that turn you into The Rock in 5 minutes. I would definitely appreciate one of those about now. It will either be shakes that turn you into The Rock, or society is ruled by aliens/robots, or society just doesn't exist. I guess we'll see. But it is because of that fact that the 2050s will have an advantage over the 2010s that I think it's ridiculous to hold this against the 90s. Like, are we going to discredit LeBron's accomplishment in 30 years because he was playing Twitch streamers and SoundCloud rappers? Like, no, that's stupid. If a player like Michael Jordan played in the modern era, he would be able to do something like what LeBron does, which is spend $1 million a year maintaining his body and making sure it's at its peak performance. Also, I find it ridiculous that the fact that there were expansion teams in the 90s is used as a reason to say the competition was weaker. If you did not know, from 1989 to 2000, the NBA added 4 franchises to the league. The Vancouver Grizzlies, which obviously eventually became the Memphis Grizzlies, the Minnesota Timberwolves, the Orlando Magic, and the Toronto Toronto Raptors. And every time a new team was introduced, the NBA would allow all the other teams to protect a certain amount of their players, and then the remaining players would go into a pool that the new teams would draft from. So the argument was that 1, these teams made the overall talent of the other teams in the NBA a bit weaker, but more importantly 2, this added some teams to the NBA that were horrible. And because of that, there were basically free wins for every good team in the league. This is stupid for many reasons, but 1, the players on the teams that were left to get drafted were left that way for a reason that didn't really hurt the actual talent of most of those teams. But 2, a handful of free wins really isn't all that important in the long run. What ultimately matters is the playoffs. Sure, the expansion teams weaken the talent at the bottom of the barrel, but ultimately I don't think that impacted the product itself. And also, it's not like an expansion team is the only way for horrible teams to exist. In the past, in the 2010s, there have been plenty of god-awful teams that were not expansion teams. And also, one more thing, one of those expansion teams was the Orlando Magic, and by 1993 they had both Shaq and Penny, and by 1995 they were in the finals. So if those bad teams count against the 90s, then that good expansion team should count as a positive for the 90s. And once again, comparing this to the modern era, because of these new NBA teams, talent is more evenly distributed throughout the league, which means that team-by-team competition is a little bit weaker in comparison to when the league had 25 teams. That card can be played both ways. But now let's talk about really just one myth that NBA fans of the 90s love to spew to make it look like the greatest era ever. There's really only one thing from the 90s that I think is just a straight up myth, and that is the notion that NBA defensive players were better then than they are now. The thing is, yes, the 90s was a defensive era, but that was not because of the skill of the defenders. See, one of the most popular things old heads love to say to be critical of the modern NBA is that players today just don't play defense. This is not true at all. What is the actual truth is a combination of some rule changes as well as how the game has evolved has led to the NBA today being more about offense than defense. In the 90s, you had hand checking and teams were allowed to foul the fuck out of you. Which, by the way, I don't count that as defense, I count that as tackling somebody. Sure, that's a defense in football, but it's not defense in basketball. It's just assault. The only rule that benefited offenses in the 90s was the illegal defense rule, which made players have to commit to double teams or risk a penalty. Basically, zone defense or any variant of it was not allowed in any capacity. You had to play man-to-man. Compare that to today, where hand checking is completely gone, and what wouldn't even be a flagrant foul in the 90s gets you thrown out of the game today. All of this is true, however, I don't think that equals 90s players being better at defense. I think this equals 90s rules being more defense-friendly. Also, the most important change in how defense is played has been the difference in spacing in today's game. When I did my comparison video between the 2017 Warriors and the 1996 Bulls, I said in a hypothetical matchup I thought the Warriors would win because of modern playstyles, including them being way better at three-point shooting. And I genuinely got a comment that said that the Bulls shooting was just as good because they had Steve Kerr, Judd Bushler, and Tony Kukoc. No, I'm not kidding. There are some people that are that delusional. So let me make something clear. No amount of shooting from the 90s outside of a few individual players such as Reggie Miller and Mitch Richmond is even remotely comparable to shooting today. Those three guys shot a combined 45% from three, however this was on only 6.8 attempts per game, which means they hit a grand total of 3.1 threes a game, and this was in a year where the three-point line was shortened, so that percentage doesn't even really count. In comparison to the 2017 Warriors, Curry, Clay, and KD shot 23.3 threes a game, over 3 times those three, while shooting 40% with a normal distance three-point line. To most of us, I'm sure this is very obvious, but I think it's often understated how massive of a difference there is in shooting talent today versus then. And it's because of that radical difference in shooting that defense is played radically different. And while yes, illegal defense somewhat made up for the fact that you had to commit to double teams, the fact that most players could not shoot made it a lot easier to commit to double teams. Because of this, because illegal defense you had to commit to a double team, even with zones now allowed, it's much harder to commit to the double than it was back then because everyone pretty much on the floor can shoot. That and the fact that fouls are called for a lot less than they used to be is the reason why defenses today are a lot less impactful than defenses then. And I would go as far as to say that being a very impactful defender today is a lot fucking harder than it was back then, and it's more impressive. Because everyone can shoot and there's now way more space on the court any given night, you have to be able to cover more ground. And because of the ability for players to shoot, when you're in a pick and roll, you very often have to switch, which means you have to be able to defend multiple positions. I've seen former players say that players today are weak for switching, but in reality, in a pick and roll at the top of the three-point line in 1993, you didn't have to worry about 95% of guards being able to pull up from a couple feet behind the line. In 2020, and in the past decade really, you have had to worry about that. And this is why you see players switching a lot more today than they used to, not because they're incapable of fighting through a screen, but rather because it's a lot quicker, which gives shooters a lot less daylight. And if you want to point to players in general not really caring about defense like they used to, specifically star players, that existed plenty in the 90s as well. Reggie Miller is not a defender. Charles Barkley, Clyde Drexler, Shaq outside of his first 2 years of his career, Glenn Rice, Glenn Robinson, Chris Mullin, Chris Webber, Tim Hardaway, Sean Kemp. These are all players who really did not put that much effort up on defense. That's something that some players just didn't do throughout pretty much every era of NBA history. That's nothing new. You guys just like to look at the 90s through rose-colored glasses. So no, competition in the 90s was not weaker, it just lacked some of the advantages of the modern NBA. The expansion teams added to the league did not make the competition weaker, or at least no less than it did to the long-term impacts of those teams existing in the modern NBA. And defensive players of the 90s were no more skilled and arguably less skilled than defensive players of today's game. They just had an advantage with how the league favored defense at the time. Those are the many myths of the 90s. That is the end of this video. Please be sure to like and subscribe for more NBA content like this, and cue the outro music.